Well, there is this narrative that we do present to ourselves in which questions of endangerment become the star point for thinking about political discussion. And I think what this gives rise to is a very particular conception of the political. And the political in this regard is grounded in what we might call the security imperative. Right? So if we start politics with questions of endangerment and violence, then this gives rise to the question of the security imperative, through which we have a very particular narrative around political community. So political communities are then understood to be formed or coalesce around a shared sense of endangerment, and therefore we kind of need one another in order to kind of survive and then make sense of the world. And through this we then have notions of togetherness, cultural enrichment, which kind of emerge out of this kind of primordial condition of survivability. Now, through this kind of narrative, we have almost like the prioritization then of certain wills to rule. So the first will to rule is, in order to deal with endangerment, you need security, and security means order. Now, but of course, when we talk about order, what we're talking about is putting life into order. So that kind of naturalizes hierarchy, it naturalizes the power over people, and survivability then also becomes naturalized. So we can actually say that, for instance, that it's perfectly normal and natural in the hierarchical scheme of things to say that some human beings are more adept at surviving than others. So in that sense, questions of the good life versus the bad life can become associated with notions such as healthy populations, unhealthy populations, which, as we know historically, has been the basis for thinking about questions of racism and kind of these kinds of narratives. So the way in which we then, so if we frame the human condition through languages of endangerment and survivability, this gives rise to, or authenticates, the logics of sovereignty and also eventually logics of progress. And progress in a way which is all about a very particular survivalist narrative and a survivalist ethos. If, of course, we were to just slightly flip the optic and kind of say, well, one of the questions which I would ask back in return is, what function does it serve if we say that, politics begins with endangerment? What's being left out of the narrative, right? And this is a very familiar kind of, logic that we can say, well, politics begins with survival, therefore there's some existential enemy, whether it's the environment or it's nature or it's, some animal or it's another group of people, which is forcing us in order to become political, right? If we flip the optic slightly, and I would say, why would I want to secure a population, or why would I want to secure my friends, or why would I want to secure my family, if there wasn't something which precedes this sense of endangerment, And that preceding of endangerment to me is the politics of love, the politics of compassion, the politics of empathy. But we kind of write this out of the script when we begin with endangerment, because it's almost like the endangerment gives rise to everything we know about the political, rather than seeing there's something deeply political prior to this, which works in a way which then gives rise to questions of security, rights, justice, and so forth. I think, something happens during the 20th century when, first of all, there is this kind of shift towards theorizing, of course, the monopolization of violence. So the modern nation state gives to itself the idea that it has a monopoly over violence, right? And so it doesn't do away with violence, but it basically monopolizes the potential use of violence for its own security and so forth. Now, in the 20th century, as we've, is well documented, the 20th century is also a history of revolution and political struggle, through which we have a very particular narrative of conflict, where conflict becomes ideological. And so very much even in the 20th century, that is, and particularly the latter part of the 20th century, there is this notion that conflict is somehow dangerous, or conflict is, the cause of actual real violence. Now, we that really is the case. We do have these conflicting ideologies, and the 20th century is not without coincidence called the century of violence, because we do have these conflicts which give rise to the massacre of tens of millions of people. Right? But the question is it's not so much about conflict, but the types of conflict. And if we look at the types of conflict, for instance, in the 20th century, first of all, if we're looking at conflicts between competing nations, right, they are logically very similar. Right? So the conflict between nations is logically very similar in so much as both are premised on the very idea that one particular nation has national supremacy over another. Right? Or even if we look at the great ideological conflicts between capitalism and communism, to my mind, there's much more in commonality with those ideological systems than what actually separates them. Both capitalism and communism, for instance, reduce life to an economic variable. Right? And in that sense, both see actually difference as a problem to be solved. You look, for instance, the way in which both capitalist regimes and also communist regimes did deal with indigenous people throughout the Americas. Right? Both of them see them as a completely problematic population. So what I find in terms of the way in which we understand conflict, we often see these as being kind of modes of difference, whereas actually I think they're defined more by modes of similarity and modes of an attempt to claim almost like a universal authentication over what it means to be human. So that collapse, as we see in the 21st century, still exists to the point where it's almost indistinguishable today, where if we talk about conflict today, it's invariably talked about as being the source of potential violence. And part of this goes through the extension of the narrative that conflict is dangerous, but it's now globally dangerous. It's not just locally dangerous. Conflict is now seen to be globally dangerous today. And this, I think, does us a great disservice in terms of thinking about the political. And I don't mean conflict in a very clear sense of enmity. So a conflict between, you know, I'm going to conflict with you, therefore there is this clear sense of them or us or me or you in terms of ideas. I mean conflicts around who I am as a political subject. And I want to affirm my life as a political subjectivity. And if you are denying me that affirmation, then invariably we are going to be involved in a conflict of ideas. Why is it that we find it so difficult to live with a world of affirmative differences? And of course, a lot of people who believe in the question of the universal will suddenly say, well, you're just being culturally relativist, right? You're advocating a world of difference, therefore, how do you account for, you know, fascism or, you know, the worst cases of human abuse? And I would argue, you know, if we are going to look towards a world where we pride and promote difference, that requires an ethical reciprocity. That requires seeing difference not as a problem to be solved, but to have a mutual respect for people's differences in terms of how we affirm one another's freedom and liberty to live the way we want to live. Well, I think the alternative is, first of all, we need to recognize the creative power of political transformation. So, for too long we think about, you know, revolution and transformation as simply a negating of the world, and this negating of the world becomes this almost kind of, you know, this giant refusal that the world is intolerable and therefore we must fight against the kind of system and then in order to reimagine it anew. Right? I think we need to break out of that dialectical entrapment. You know, theorists of, you know, Nietzsche was theorizing around this question of all we simply do is recreate the master-slave dichotomy. But I think more fundamentally is what we need is a different concept of the political. And what I mean by that is we often see politics and the political as grounded in the so-called social sciences. And those social sciences give rise to a very particular concept of humanism based on questions of rationality, reasonability, calculation, and so forth, which, as we know historically, has actually stripped the human out of our political analysis. And some of the greatest violence takes place in the name of reasoned, rational, calculated thinking. Right? And it becomes an objectifying process. Life, to become an object of study, you need to objectify life. And there's no easier way to dehumanize someone than to objectify them by taking an objective position. Right? So I think what we need to do is basically rethink what the political might mean in more artistic terms. Now, I'm not simply referring to pictures on walls, although that's important in terms of rethinking about aesthetics. What I mean by rethinking the political in more artistic terms is to tap into what we might call the irreducible qualities of human experience. And what does it mean to start politics, not just simply from questions of reason, rationality, calculation, deliberation, or enmity or endangerment, but what would happen if we started our political understanding from questions of love, empathy, dignity, compassion? Those qualities about the human condition, which we know are very real, we know they're very emotional, we know they grab us, but we cannot quantify them. We cannot write them into some social scientific formula. But they are very real to this. And to me, it's precisely with the arts where we have a window into this. You know, we just take the simple artwork. So in terms of, you go into a gallery and you look at a Mark Rothko painting, and it captures you emotionally. It really does something to the psyche in which it makes you feel alive. Right? And what I think is part of our problem has been almost the stripping away of the human and the stripping away of emotion as a political category. So by rethinking politics in more artistic and human terms, that demands a different emotional register, where emotion itself is not a problem. Or if emotion is a problem, it's the manipulation of emotions for fascistic ends which is a problem. But we need to liberate the ethical capacity for us to feel and recognize the world's beauty and pain.